Hello everybody, today I'm doing a review for Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. This book is also called The Golden Compass in the US, I believe. This is the first book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. I will do a non-spoiler section at the beginning of this video, and then I will go into spoilers a bit later on, but I will put a warning when I go into spoilers. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about non-spoilers. Alright, so this is basically a science fantasy, high fantasy story. So this world is really based on our world, but it isn't really our world, it's just very similar. And a lot of the fantastical elements of this story are actually based on science and physics, which is quite interesting. I feel like this is the first book that I read that has that kind of aspects. What I find a bit weird about this book is that I can't really put an age range around it, so this could be a middle grade book given how old the main characters are. However, I feel like the themes and the story don't really fit middle grade or even YA, because I don't know if the themes that are being tackled here are really something that even the YA audience would really enjoy. So I feel like this could fit anywhere. Like, I think a child that is quite mature could read it, and even a young adult could read it, but I feel like a lot of the themes are really something that belong in an adult fantasy series. So yeah, it's a bit weird where to put this, so I don't know where I would put it. So I find the world in this book really interesting. I think this idea of having a very similar world to ours, but being slightly different with certain fantastical elements, is really interesting. And in this story, actually, every person has a creature called demon, which is basically an animal that kind of represents their soul and is kind of connected to each person. As a child, the demon is kind of a shapeshifter, so it can change what kind of animal it is. But as people get older, the demon settles down into one form, which is quite interesting, because this really brings some interesting aspects to character interactions. Because even if a character is kind of behaving in a certain way or trying to fool another character, you can kind of check the behavior of the demon and kind of find out if their behavior is actually legitimate or if they're just trying to fool you, which is a really interesting concept. And it really brings an interesting aspect to just scenes where you only have one character, because you always have this like interaction between the character and its demon, which is really interesting. So our main character is Lyra, who we follow for basically all of this book, and she has her demon called Pantalaimon. And so even in scenes where we only have Lyra, we get a lot of interaction between Lyra and Pantalaimon, which is really, really interesting. Lyra as a character is also quite interesting. I think she is 12 years old. Let me check. She's 12, so quite young, and she is kind of this tomboyish character who grew up in this like Oxford University, which is obviously similar to Oxford University in our world. This book has a very interesting and kind of fast beginning, where you get introduced to a lot of different concepts and a lot of different ideas pretty early on, which really hooks you into the story. But I feel like the pace drops quite early on, so you get a few really cool scenes in the beginning, but then for the next 100 pages or so, the pace really drops. It drops a bit too low for me, and I feel like there was an issue with the fact that this book is just a single point of view book, because we only get Lyra's point of view, so it feels like a lot of the setup has to be done through Lyra, which obviously means that all the setup has to be done sequentially, and you can't do it parallelly, which I think kind of hurts the pacing of this book. So while I enjoyed the beginning, I struggled through this book for like the next 120 pages or so. But the second act of this story is incredibly strong, and the third act of this story is so great that after I finished this book, I kind of wanted to go into the next book, but I held off, and I haven't read the second book until now even, because I felt like I needed a break from this story, because I didn't want to go after the great third act of this book. I didn't want to go back to a maybe slower paced first act again. I quite enjoyed this book. It ended up being a really weird read, because while I really enjoyed the second and third acts of this book, I really struggled in the first act. And I actually even contemplated DNFing it before I got to the second act, which I usually don't do. Like, usually I don't have this feeling of like I need to DNF a book, but I did almost end up DNFing this book, which obviously hampers my enjoyment of it. But really, at the end of this book, I really felt good about the book. So I would still recommend it because I feel like maybe I just wasn't in the mood for reading a bit of a slower paced book. But at the end of the book, I really, really enjoyed it. I ended up giving this book 3.75 out of 5 stars just because of the fact that I had this big issue with the pacing. But apart from that, this was a really, really good book. So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this kind of story, to go into this book and read it. I think a lot of people will enjoy this book. I haven't yet continued with the rest of the series. I do plan to, and when I do, I will be doing reviews for the upcoming books as well. As for this book, I would highly recommend you to read it. I will go into spoilers now for a bit, so if you have not read the book, you may want to turn off right now. I will have a timestamp on the screen that will tell you when the spoiler section ends and when my final thoughts starts. So yeah, you may want to skip ahead to that timestamp or maybe turn off the video. Let's talk a little bit about spoilers now. So as I already said, I think the beginning of this book was really, really good. I think the starting scene really introduced Lyra's character very, very interestingly. We see her snooping around the college and kind of like trying to get into the master's chambers. And yeah, she obviously, during that scene, she figures out that the master is trying to poison her uncle, Lord Asriel. And yeah, I feel like that scene in itself was a really good introduction to Lyra, but also to her demon Pantalaimon, and it was a good start to show us this like dynamic between the character Lyra and the demon. So I think that was done really, really well, and it set up a really cool concept. And then obviously we get introduced to Lord Asriel and a lot about his research in the north. He's kind of researching on this dust, and yeah, which is basically something that is forbidden. It's a really interesting introduction to this concept of dust, and yeah, kind of a hint towards the alternate universe aspect of this world or of this universe. And I think this start really showed some really, really interesting concepts and ideas for the story that I was really interested in. And that's kind of, I feel like, why I was a bit annoyed at what happened in the next 100 pages, because we saw that Lord Asriel left, and then basically all these concepts were not talked about for quite a while. We got introduced to the Gobblers or the Oblation Board, and we see that these children are being kidnapped, and Lyra's friend Roger is kidnapped, which obviously is an interesting story in itself, but I was always more interested in the aspects that were set up in the beginning. So that's why I kind of had this weird feeling that I wasn't enjoying the book as much, although I was really interested in the concepts. And it's actually those concepts that made me not quit reading this book. I feel like Lord Asriel's presentation and everything he said to the scholars of Oxford at that meeting was really interesting, and the way the way Lyra and Asriel kind of stopped him from being poisoned was also quite fun. The next third was basically, I feel, a lot of world building. We get Lyra in the college, Lyra with Roger, then we get introduced to the Egyptians, we get introduced to Mrs. Coulter, we get introduced to the whole child kidnapping stuff, and then we see Lyra move away with Miss Coulter, then we see her run away, and we see her with the Egyptians again, which obviously these are all things that are interesting, but I feel like it felt like the fact that Lyra had to go through all these steps to set up all these aspects of the story kind of hurt it a bit. I think it would have been better maybe to have another point of view where we could have basically Lyra's part, and then maybe we could have built up the Egyptians separately, and then maybe they could have converged to one basic story, rather than making Lyra go through the whole aspect with Miss Coulter and yeah, the college first, and then we get again a long passage where we see the Egyptians through Lyra's eyes. I feel like that part was kind of a bit slow and plodding, but it did set up some really nice things down the line. So at the end, it did pay off. But while I was reading that part, I wasn't really interested in picking up the book again, because it just felt like nothing really related to the things that I was interested in was happening. But then we get this whole expedition where the Egyptians decide they want to see what is happening with these children, and they want to kind of get these children back, and Lyra joins them for this journey. And yeah, that's where I think this really picked up. And I think the moment Lyra got kidnapped, this book really took off. And after that, like, it was really a page turner, and it felt like I really wanted to fly through this book. And yeah, the scenes where we get Lyra getting captured, and then when we have her in captivity off the oblation board, are really, really interesting. And it's, yeah, the whole research that the oblation board is doing with these children is, I would say it is interesting, although it is really, really cruel. And I feel like all those scenes seem really interesting, and I really wanted to find out what they're doing, and really what kind of effect this, like, separating, or I think it was called intercision, that they're trying to separate the demon from the person, that what kind of effect that had. I feel like it was an interesting exploration, but it was really, really also a cruel exploration doing that to children. And I feel like that's where I feel like the themes of this story and this story aspect seems like something that maybe isn't something that children or a young adult audience should read, because I feel like that's a really dark approach to the story. And I feel like if this is something that will be focused more on, or similar stuff, I feel like this is really more an adult-oriented story. So yeah, that's where a bit of the weirdness came in, and I was really surprised, because I thought this was a YA or middle grade book, and the fact that he went to this place really, yeah, shocked me a bit. The action sequence where Lyra gets freed is really, really interesting, and it sets up another really interesting third act, which is crazy, because for me personally, like, just the second act seems like something that could have basically made a whole book. Obviously, then only half of the book would have been great, in my opinion. But I feel like then the third act we get on Svalbard, I think, is also incredible. We get Lyra with these ice bears, and yeah, we have this other bear, Eorek and Eofer, who, yeah, have this, like, amazing, yeah, battle scene or one-on-one combat scene, which was really interesting, and I thought that was done really, really well. Yeah, it was a very good action sequence, and that obviously led to Eorek becoming the king of the Ice Bears again, and it led to us finally getting to see what Lord Asriel is doing in the north. And the whole scenes between Lyra, Asriel, and Roger were incredible. We meet Asriel again in, yeah, his exile home, basically, where he is researching on dust. His reaction to seeing Lyra is actually really interesting, because he kind of gets afraid when Lyra gets there, and Lyra is really, she's taken aback by the fact that her uncle is actually so shocked, and yeah, just is so shocked to see her and doesn't want her around. But that reaction kind of shows that the only reason that he had this, like, shock reaction was because he needed a child to sacrifice for the research that he was planning to do. So yeah, when Lyra showed up, he was really afraid that he had to sacrifice her. But when he sees Roger, he's like, okay, I have this other child that I can use. And then the whole scene after that, when he takes Roger and, yeah, wants to do his experiment, and Lyra follows him, and we get this big action scene where Mrs. Coulter shows up again, and the witches show up again, and the bears show up again. This whole action scene and the last 50-60 pages of this book are crazy, and crazy good. The whole revelation about Lyra being Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel's daughter actually are incredible, and really shine a very different light on all three characters. The action sequences are great, the whole revelations regarding the science is great, and then obviously we get this whole revelation that northern lights are kind of related to this dust, and through the northern lights you can basically see alternate universes or parallel universes, which is an incredible, like, concept to think about. And then we obviously get this shocking moment where Asriel sacrifices Roger to kind of create a bridge between their world and the world that they kind of can see through the northern lights. And we see that Asriel passes through that bridge to the other world, and he kind of wants to take Miss Coulter with him, but she doesn't go. And then at the very end of this book, we see Lyra passing to the other world as well, which ends up being a really crazy, like, ending sequence. And that end really makes you want to pick up the next book, because you really want to find out what is happening, and what is this other world where they can pass, and what is happening in general and what will happen to Lyra, what will happen with Azriel. Yeah, there are so many different questions that arise in that moment that I personally really felt like I need to pick up the second book, but I hesitated on doing that because while I was interested in picking up the next book, I also knew that it would probably start slow again. So I didn't want to go from this like amazingly paced third act back to a rather slow-paced first act of the second book. That's why I decided to take a break from this series and just wait until I got back in the mood to read it, and I am getting back in the mood to read that story. So I may actually end up reading the second book quite soon. But yeah, so all in all, I feel like those last 50-60 pages of this book were great, and I just wanted to fly through all of them. I wanted to find out what is happening. I wanted to see all these revelations and all this like build up that we have kind of be paid off. And I feel like it was paid off in an incredible way. And yeah, that's all what I have to say for spoilers, actually. So for my final thoughts on this book, I really, really enjoyed this book. I would highly recommend anybody to read it. There are a lot of interesting ideas and concepts introduced in this book that can really be fleshed out even more in the second and third books. I like how the fantasy elements of this book are really science-based, and how he uses scientific facts and scientific theories, how he creates this universe using all these scientific aspects that really creates a very, very unique world and story. I would highly recommend you to read it. If you read Northern Lights, let me know in the comments down below what you thought about this book and what you think about my thoughts. Yeah, so please do not write spoilers for the second and third books in the trilogy in the comments, because I will still want to read those. If you have not read this book, do not go in the comments because there will be spoilers. So if you like this video, leave a like, leave a subscribe, hit the notify bell, check out my other videos. Some of them should have popped up on the screen right now. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.